Okay.
We're ready to roll.
Yep, that's it.
Okay. Well, comrades, you're all welcome to this meeting of the Workers' International Network. Tonight's discussion is about education, and our speaker is Carel Buxton, who herself was a head primary teacher and is a lifelong socialist activist. Education has always been a key demand and a key question in the socialist movement internationally. It had a particular relevance in Britain in the 60s when the Labour government introduced the comprehensive school system in order to overcome the class divisions that existed between the secondary moderns, which were for people that failed the 11 plus, and then the grammar schools for those who had ambitions to succeed in the state, bureaucracy, and business, and elsewhere. And in addition to that, there were also technical schools. The idea was to train and educate people to work in industry and in the trades. That was all amalgamated into a single type of school called the comprehensive. Unfortunately, that's now not getting the support that it should. I myself worked for the Inner London Education Authority in the comprehensive school in the 60s, which brought together working class communities from, say, Hammersmith, Shepherd's Bush, and West London, and also some of the wealthier people, the families of some of the embassy staff and people like that. So it was a genuinely comprehensive movement. The On the other hand, then there were always these private schools, privately educated people, and the purpose of these, and a lot of them were run by religious orders. It needs to be borne in mind as well. The purpose was to educate the leaders, as they called them, the tops of business, the tops of government, and the tops of the army. They were educated in these private schools, the fees for which were the same size as the annual salary of many workers. So we still have these divisions in education, and they need to be abolished. In addition to that question, there's also the issue of access to education. And that's been always a key demand for socialists, access and universal free education for all. Access for everything from nursery schools right the way through to university education and research. That should all be accessible and free for everybody in society. It's always been a key demand, not just in Britain and in my case in Ireland, but right across the globe. And the issue of education for girls is a key question now in countries such as Afghanistan, Pakistan, and such places, where girls do not get the full access, and in some cases, no access whatever to any kind of education. So, with that, few brief comments, I'll hand over to Carol. And Carol has a long record working in education as a primary school head and also as a socialist activist in East London for many, many years. So, how much time do you think you might need, Carol?
About 25 minutes, and I've got my timer on when
Have
I
you?
start
Okay.
talking.
Oh,
Okay.
you won't need a reminder then.
Oh, I
Okay.
might do if I go
Okay.
over.
So, Carel Buxton, we're lucky to have Carol tonight. So, away you go there, Carol.
Thank you very much, Finn. That's a very nice introduction. And now we're in a situation where we have privatisation through the academies movement. Sounds posh, doesn't it? Your child goes to an academy, but what it means is that the government, instead of giving money to locally democratically elected local education authorities, that the money goes to academies and academy chains. There is a primary school head teacher who is the CEO, not head teacher. He was a head teacher of one school, but he's now CEO of 72 schools. The highest paid academy chain CEO earns £500,000 a year, and between 150,000 and 300,000 pounds a year is not unknown as the leader of an academy chain. And I spent the latter part of my work in school and then as a retired person fighting against the anti-academy movement that was brought in initially by Tony Blair but championed by Michael Gove, Conservative. So, that fight's largely been lost, I'm afraid to say. So where do we go from here? Well, there's quite a few people on here that have been teachers or who are teachers. You've all been to school though, so you all know quite a lot about schools and how you think they should work. Education for a socialist society is a very big topic. So I'm going to start with something very personal to sort of illustrate how education has changed. I'm going to draw an example. I'm going to draw on a personal example, and that I am going to try this afternoon to draw in countries not just in the UK, but much wider than that. So from the personal standpoint, first of all, my grandmother, who was born in 1899, and she was in a rural community in the south of England. She was in a one-class school. There was about 60 pupils in her class, and it was very likely she was taught by a pupil teacher, not a qualified teacher. Maybe somebody who was, in their early 20s. She would have learned the 3 R's and some needlework. She wasn't very good at needlecraft, but she was also not very good at the reading and the writing bit. I've got 3 books from her that she sent to me as a child. And in it, she's written Love from Nanny 3 different ways. But she was extremely good at maths. She was a whiz at mental arithmetic. And I know this for a fact because at the betting office, she could work out the odds on the horses better than anyone else I ever knew. So she left school when she was 10. Now, the actually legal leaving age was 11, but in rural communities, in industrial areas, kids were needed to work on the farm and in the factories and help around the house. So she left school when she was 10. My mum was born in the 1930s. She was very bright, and she left school when she was 15, which was the leaving age. She passed the 11 plus, which Finn referred to, but she didn't go to the grammar school. Like a lot of working class kids, it was because they couldn't afford the uniform, the bus fare. But I think actually the thing that was the straw that broke the camel's back was that my grandparents couldn't afford a lacrosse or stick or a tennis racket or something like that. So she was very bright, and as an adult, she was able to access night school. She did typing, then she did O-levels, A-levels, and other qualifications. That set the ground for me because I was born 12 years after World War II. As part of the post-war settlement, I went to a grammar school. It was a grammar school for 1 year, and then it became a secondary modern school, a comprehensive school. A lot of the teachers liked the grammar school system, and some of them went over to fee-paying schools. But I was lucky. I did O-levels, A-levels, went to university, got a full grant, paid no fees, and lived in halls and had board and lodging. That was the post-war settlement. My daughter is a primary school teacher. She went to university in the 2010s. There were no grants by then. She paid fees, or rather I paid them, but she still had debt, and which she is now paying for at the age of 36. In the UK, this has become a very, very big issue. And the Chancellor, I think it was only last week, the British Chancellor said that people who benefit from university education should pay it back, and that university fees were the right way to go. And actually, lots of people are paying huge interest. So we have these horror stories of medical students who, when they qualify, have got 70 grand's worth of debt, but actually 3 years later, it's 100 grand, because it just goes up year on year. And what we say as socialists is that education is a human right, but it is more than that. It is a societal good, because it not just liberates the minds and potential of an individual, but it can transform, and often does transform, society. And there's been a lifelong struggle for education by ordinary people, for decent schools. The desire to be literate, particularly, continues to this day. So I'm going to give you a few statistics. In the world today, there are around, according to UNESCO figures, 272 million children and young people without schools. That means that they have no school to go to. That's a very, very shocking number. And it hits girls disproportionately. In terms of literacy, globally, about 90% of boys are literate at the age of 15 globally, compared with girls, which is 83%. I think it was Malcolm X who said, if you educate a man, you educate an individual. If you educate a girl, you educate and liberate a nation. Now, there are huge regional differences across the globe in terms of literacy. 99% of developed nations have around 99% literacy. In Southern and Western Asia, it's about 70%, and in Sub-Saharan Africa, it's 64%. Where countries like the Congo, which is hugely rich in resources, mineral resources, etc., they have very, very high levels of illiteracy and children out of school, and kids are at risk of child marriage. This is very much a historical remnant of colonialism and the many, many wars that have gone on in that area. Across the globe, there are 800 million illiterate adults. And this is the even more shocking figure, that 2/3 of them are women and girls. So the education of women and girls is the key, because it will liberate males, boys as well, if you educate and make sure that the mother is literate. Now, there are some hugely impressive gains in this area. Some countries, against all the odds, in very undeveloped areas, have managed to combat this. And according to the OECD, you will find that, there's the whole lists on their website of countries that top their sliding scale of the best education systems in the world. Finland generally comes top, and alongside other Scandinavian countries, alongside South Korea, obviously the UK, America, Australia, Japan. They're rich, developed countries. I want to have a look at the significant achievement in an underdeveloped country. And I want to look at the huge gains that have been made in education in Bolivia. It really is a model. Despite all the coups, the wars, the revolutions, I think in a space of 2 years at some point, they had 10 different governments. There is chronic political instability in Bolivia. In the 1950s and 60s, around 1/3 of the population wasn't literate. And then Evo Morales was elected to the presidency in 2005, and I think he was president until about 2018-19. He was the first indigenous leader elected to a presidency in Latin America. And he was a former union leader of the cocoa growers. His focus of his government was very much on education and health and what they called decolonizing the system, focusing on indigenous heritage and accessibility. So to tackle the widespread illiteracy in the rural areas, they did the following things. They increased educational funding to 23% of the country's annual budget, which is quite remarkable. I'm not sure what it is in Britain, but I don't think it's much more than about 10-15%. But 23% is remarkable. The education of peasants, as they were called in the rural areas, was around the issues of bilingual education. So they actually taught people to be literate in their native language rather than in Spanish to begin with, and then moving into ensuring that they were fluent and literate in Spanish too, as it is the lingua franca of the country. They got support from other countries. They had a lot of support from Venezuela and from Cuba, but they also had this idea of self-support, which was, yes, I can. If you can if you can read, you should be able to teach one other person to read. So by 2010, remember he was elected president in 2005. By 2010, UNESCO said that there were no illiterate adults in Bolivia. That's absolutely stunning. It's what you can achieve when you have a clear purpose and a clear plan. He also promoted productive and community education. So it was like skills-based education, so that young people would learn how to grow crops, how to cook, farm, etc., care for livestock. Interestingly, secularization of the curriculum, the removal of the domination of the Catholic Church. They tended to dominate the private schools, and obviously they weren't entirely successful. There was huge pushback. But they did make inroads into replacing the curriculum, which was very religious, with the study of the indigenous world and diverse faiths. I think my favourite bit was about anti-imperialist training, because of course as socialists we would want to offer anti-imperialist training. So they taught in the military academy initially, teaching regional history, anti-colonial ideas to counter the US influence. And of course, they had immediately free compulsory education from the age of 4 to 17 and free education at university and college. One other thing, which is a bit of an aside in a way, but the other thing that they did, which I find absolutely fascinating, they implemented a women's only police force. And I have heard the deputy of the women's police force. I've heard her speak, and one of the things they use this force for is to deal with any violence against women, any domestic violence, any rape or sexual assaults on women. It's investigated by female police force only, not by males. They also have a radical program on health, which is very focused on women's health. So they have suffered a coup in 2019, and it is now a very unstable system. There is great fear that they will be invaded. Recently at a meeting on Latin America, a spokesperson for the government said they think Venezuela was won, Cuba was 2 and Bolivia was 3 on the list for invasion by America. So, you know, in addition to all of those achievements, which I think are quite remarkable in such a short space of time, and you have the beginnings of a real socialist plan there for education, you do have additional achievements in places like Cuba, however limited that may be, but they are world class in terms of their music, art, dance, etc., their education. I mean, they produce world-class professionals like Carlos Acosta, even though they've had sanctions for 70 years and terrible shortages and are under terrible threat from America. And we don't have in the UK, we have a dearth of subjects. We have very little music now, very little art, in terms, and also very little sport, because a lot of playing fields have been sold off under the academisation agenda. Indeed, myself, when I was a head teacher in the East End, the local MP came for a visit. We had a playing field. Part of it was unusable because it had remnants of an old building, and I took him out to see this. And he suggested that we sold it. If we sold it to a developer for housing, we'd make money. Hundreds of playing fields have been sold off. Open spaces for young people are limited, and a lot of public swimming baths have been lost as well. So I believe that in the UK we have a very narrow, rigid curriculum. I think Roger will have something to say about the English curriculum. But in the primary school, it's not really the study of English, it's the study of literacy. And the focus is on literacy, on pieces of texts. And there's very little reading for pleasure. There's just snippets of literature. There's also a focus on maths and science. Lots of homework. Most of it a waste of time. Testing starts very early. Even children of rising 5 are tested. And in year 1, children have what is called a phonics test, where they are tested in the most ridiculous way. They're given these nonsense words to decode. A child in my school failed the phonics test. She was very bright. She was probably the best reader in her class. And when I explained to the family why she failed it, is because she read it for meaning. So instead of reading stupid words like smark, S-M-A-R-K, she read it as smart, S-M-A-R-T. She did that with about 4 or 5 words, and so failed the test and had to retake it in year 2. So highly regulated education system. And I think that teachers feel underpaid. We know they're underpaid, they're undervalued, they're extraordinarily overworked. And there's been huge loss of funding since 2010. And as the system begins to decline more, there's very little scope for any of this to be under this system to be changed without a big fight. There's lots of restless pupils who, there isn't corporal punishment, but there are other ways of punishing children. They're very, very rigid behaviour policies, which again, I think Roger may mention something about this as well in secondary schools. And instead of giving them a whack with a cane, which is what would have happened when I was at school, and could happen right up until the 70s in England. There are isolation rooms where children are set aside from others, and very high levels of exclusion of children, particularly of Black children and children with special educational needs. Now, that all sounds very grim, doesn't it? But there is a very huge fight back that's happened. Historically in America, with the desegregating movement, Black Lives Matter, Greta Thunberg, but more recently, even I think it was earlier this month in Germany, the young people, 50,000 school students went out on strike against compulsory military service. Most of them were between the ages of 14 and 18, but some of them, a sizable number, were 10 and 12-year-olds. So in Germany, I believe the teachers are not allowed to go on strike because they're civil servants, but the teachers' unions were sympathetic and expressed support for this. So again, with teachers, there's been a huge fight back. So I suppose notably is the Chicago teachers' strike, where and the Red for Ed. I don't know if there's any American comrades on here at the moment who can talk about that. That went across 11 states in 2019, and they made hugely significant gains in terms of class size and in terms of resources, not just pay. It was a battle for education, not just about the conditions of workers. In addition to that, there's been hundreds of smaller school-based actions against privatisation, and the NEU in the UK has been quite radical in that it's widened its membership from teachers to education workers. So within the NEU now, you do have school caretakers, admin staff, cooks, and learning assistants. So what would socialism in action would it look like? And it's a demand for a democratic education. And I think as a head teacher, I try to enact this in my school. So in terms of the structures, no privatisation. We'd say there's absolutely no room for private profit motive in education, that schools should be locally managed by local authorities and democratically controlled within local councils, with teachers and pupils and parents represented on that. That's also the case for universities and colleges. Private schools, to have a system where if you've got money, you can get better resources, you can have classes of 20, you can have violin lessons, just have a little drink. You can have music lessons, you can have all the trappings of what we would consider a really good education because your parents can pay for it. That isn't an anathema to us. Well, we'd say all those private schools we'd take under control, that they would become fully comprehensive and no profits could be made. No fees, fully funded through taxation from when children are 3.5 right the way up to when they finish university. Schools would be fully resourced, small classes of 20, maximum 25. We would offer a free school meal for every child, no matter what age, and these wouldn't be mean tested, and breakfast clubs. Uniforms. Now, this is contentious. I quite like a school uniform, only because I think it's easier as a parent to say to them, you're wearing those jogging bottoms, that top, and trainers to school. Not everybody has that view, but I think in my school we had the most liberal uniform, and we gave uniform to people as well. And one of the things I did was run a uniform swap shop, when I retired, and it was not charity, but it was solidarity. Schools would have proper resources of books, libraries, electronic learning aids, school buildings, and in developing countries that would, this is about access to electricity. We'd want our teachers and school workers to be well paid and to have proper investment in teacher education, and every child to have a qualified teacher. In terms of the curriculum, well, what can I say? It's bread and it's roses. It's a focus on learning, access to the arts, and we want to decolonise education and give children an understanding of the system that they have lived under, and hopefully the new system that we could offer them. So schools would be about lifelong learning. Schools need to be safe places. And again, it comes back to education for girls, particularly in places like Afghanistan, India, Pakistan, and parts of Africa. A safe commute for children between home and school. So schools need to be within their locality. The availability of water sounds very basic, but it is a serious issue. Availability of water for hygiene, for sanitation, and including for girls and young women, menstrual support. Now, I want to say just something about early years before I conclude. This is about having a humane approach. Now, we know that the brain doubles in size between the age of birth and the age of 5. It's a huge and rapid development, and teachers and people who work with the youngest children are very much seen as a Cinderella service. I remember the only time I've ever been stopped in the street to do a survey, I was with a friend of mine who was a secondary teacher, and I was the primary teacher. And we were asked a series of questions, and then she said, what social class we were in. And he was in a higher social class than me because he taught in a secondary school and I didn't. I've never forgotten that because it really, really annoyed me terribly. The importance of early education, it really can't be overstated. I mean, during the early days of the revolution in Russia, Alexander Kollontai, Esther Armand and others really, really focused on this as a way of liberating women through the organisation of creches and nursery schools. And education was necessarily play-based. We've got, I said about Finland being and Norway and Denmark being the sort of top in terms of quality of education. I don't know whether that's true or not, but I do know that in Norway they had forest schools, which develops children's social skills, it develops their resilience, it develops their empathy, etc. It's hands-on learning, and they have this thing called risky play where kids climb trees, go quite high up, use tools, make dens, etc. I think this has sort of been extended to other communities. In Hong Kong, they have beach schools, for example, and it's tricky to try and implement that in the UK. I have tried, not very successfully, but there are some examples here of that happening as kids are outside developing their own skills and working alongside others, and it just sounds I mean, I have seen it in Norway. It is wonderful when you see 6 3-year-olds all dressed up, getting in a canoe and alone, just with the adult on the side, watching them canoeing round this little island on this lake. It's fantastic. So, in conclusion, I think the last thing I want to say is that education should be for all children and young people, but it's not just about young people, it's also about adult learning. I said my mother could go to night school and get all these qualifications. I quite like maths at school, and I wanted to do an A-level maths. Now I've retired, and you can't do that unless you pay a tutor for 25 quid an hour. There is no night school for me to do that anymore. That's all gone. I could do flower arranging or cooking at the local college, but I can't do much more than that. And I'm not interested in those things particularly. So education should be lifelong. And I believe in this system of what I call the out and the in. And the out and the in system is you can leave school at 16. I mean, currently it's 18, I think, now, but you should be able to leave school at 16, go to work, come back to school when you're 20 for 2 years if you want, and then go back into the workplace. And then when you're my age or younger, you could do your 3 years or 4 years of university education and cash it in. An out and an in, so that schools would be places where you would find grannies like me, middle-aged people, and the young. It would be a real mixture. It would not just be one class of one age group. And within that, all children should be included, whether they have disabilities or not, whether they have ability to speak the language or not. It might seem that this is a dream that can't happen, especially in today's world where we've got war blowing in so many places. The instability of the world around us is deepening, and education should not be seen as an exercise in the domination of the domination of vulnerable people, but in liberation of the working class and all oppressed groups. So I'm going to end with a quote, which is from Fred Hampton. I know people know that I really like Fred Hampton. I think he's somebody very, very special. And he said, I think Bob Crow might have stolen it from Fred, but anyway, Fred said, "If we dare to struggle, we dare to win. And if we dare not struggle, we don't deserve to win." And I think those things in education are worth struggling for. 35 minutes.
Yes, thank you, Carel.
Sorry if I went a bit over.
No, it was a very significant contribution, particularly that last piece about lifelong education. Education isn't something you finish at the age of 13 or 16 or 19 for that matter. All throughout your life, you should be able to go in and out of education. And it's particularly relevant now with the development of new technologies such as AI and people losing their jobs because methods are changing in industrial production and in commerce. People should be able to train and learn new skills all the time throughout their lives. Another point which Carl made that you need to look at is the demands in terms of education. Local education authorities controlling all the schools, not just a little number, but all schools. Significant advances have been made, such as comprehensivization and the abolition of the class division along the lines of the secondary moderns and the technical schools. But that's now being reversed, as you've explained, Carol, with the academies and the private introduction. Just give an instance of when I began teaching in London, having come from Ireland, in my first few days, I was sitting in the office of the head of house because the schools were divided into houses, groups of different classes. And the head of house, a guy called Ron Smith. And while I was there, this young kid, whose name I still remember, was called Leslie Tibbles. He knocked on the door and came in with a note. So he handed Ron Smith the note. Ron Smith took down a cane from the shelf. The kid bent over and he whacked him 12 times with the cane, wherever it was. Then he signed the docket, gave it back to the kid, and the kid brought it back to his teacher. Now, that's been abolished, at least formally, corporal punishment, but that was a very cruel thing to observe, a young kid being beaten like that by the head of house. And I'm sure that was universal, but that was an advance getting rid of corporal punishment in schools. So that's another advance. So advances have been made, but we need to make sure they're not reversed again. And we need to focus on the demands that Carel has raised in her very valuable opening contribution. Now, any Cymru can speak, either making a new contribution or asking questions, and there's plenty of time to debate, to come back and forth on the various issues. So Carel is focused on what a socialist education policy would mean in practice. So now, Cymru's that want to speak, could they indicate either electronically or we're waving our arms about, but preferably electronically. So it's open for comment and questions. Yeah, Norma.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Finn, for your introduction. Thanks very much, Carel, for your presentation. And just a few comments, a question or some comments. And first, thanks, Finn, for the introduction in which you mentioned that women, girls should and must have access to all jobs, or to all type jobs in the sense of education, to all disciplines and all types of formation, education, which previously were only reserved or consecrated to, focalized to not for human. And I'm happy to hear that, because even today is not the case always. Second, I think, posing the problem of education, as it was mentioned also last Sunday meeting here, I think that more than pedagogical or a system of education, how to the pedagogical or different kinds of schools, I think that the first point is, as it was mentioned in the Win email, education is more than individual human rights. It's a need for life in a society, an evolution and transformation of society. And all that is the difference, all make the difference in different societies. The point is, and I want to stress this aspect, that having said that is really a human right, and more than a human right, but in some regions of the world, it should be posed as a human right because it have not access at all to education, and very few access to other needs, which for us in developed countries, even capitalist and imperialist and whatever, but there are some needs which are basic needs, including education, even if not perfect or ideals, there are guaranteed for set, not for all, but for a part of the society. And so I think that is this point which we need to make clear, I mean, in others, I mean, not today, when we speak about education, and then developed countries is a reality, underdeveloped or developing countries are another history. And even for boys, I mean, not only for girls. And as I said, and as you also mentioned, there are countries in which girls have not access at all, and it's not a problem of economic need. They are forbidden to go to school, which in my mind today should be more spotted, I mean, more informed about this, the world. And it's not just for one day dedicated to education or one day dedicated to women or to girls. It's something which is really some kind of esclavage. And the final point is that really even in those countries and in those regions in which education is good, was good, and is going, I mean, all the access, I mean, take away more your countries and so on. Even that, the level in some, I can speak about Latin American set or South American, in which in countries the level of education, the public education, was good, not perfect or not ideal in capitalist society or whatever, but it was good, a level good, with access to girls and so on. That level and that situation of education degraded, I mean, declined, and the level and the level of what the children receive, the level of instruction, of the level of education, is poor and is declining. And then for those families or those people, which I am talking about a statistic, I mean, it's not just one city or one region, it's in general. And those, even in France, which have a system of public education, and those families or those groups which can afford the payment, then go to private school, not necessary, which have or choose those which have higher level. And so this is a trend which we see in many countries. And to finish that, I finish now. I have a question concerning that too. With the email, the summary email sent, which introduced to this session today, to this Sunday session, in which I read to make, factually, students are fighting back against the elitist and punitive school regime that is currently enforced. what I see in most of the public schools, I am talking about those in which the state must afford. And most of the system is not punitive. It could be that you have examples. I mean, you have bad behaviors of teachers, of the state, of the authorities. But in general, the current school regime, except in those countries in which is extremely bad. I mean, all the countries, and we know what
Norma,
which countries.
I'm sorry to interrupt you.
So
but you're
I
very
just
long.
finished.
Yeah.
I just finished, and I said that I don't understand why it was written that the current school regime is punitive, perhaps elitist, but punitive. I don't see the current system punitive. On the contrary, I should say, there's no. I mean, it's rather chaotic in general.
Thank you, Norma. Our next speaker.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for your contribution. It's a valuable contribution. John or Dominic, then followed by Matthew.
John Byrne, Finn. I'd like to thank Carol for her lead off. And it sort of awoke in me a lot of thoughts, because for 22 years, I was a Manchester City councillor. For much of that time, I was on the education committee, and the main area of my concern was special education needs. But I'm not going to touch on that today. I think Manchester was one of those cities where the term municipal socialism could have been applied to. Because when I think back, I got on the council in the 84, and that was when there was a big rift between the left and the right throughout the country in the Labour Party. And as part of the left wing, we took over in Manchester. Now, unfortunately, that did not mean, if you like, a whole revolutionary step forward. Unfortunately, it meant a capitulation to Thatcher. The old right wing in Manchester, I can only give them as an example, did have this idea of municipal socialism. I would say that we had an adult education service that was not brilliant, but when one looks back on it, it was, head and shoulders above anything in this country today. We had services, an outdoor education service, and the jewel in the crown for that was a residential place on Lake Windermere in the Lake District, where parties of children would go from schools, and that was based on the shores of Lake Windermere, where they had canoeing, they had sailing, they had rock climbing, they had caving, and they had all sorts of, if you like, ecological sort of studies. Now that was a real jewel in the crown. Another service they had was a music service, and that was a jewel in the crown as well, because schools were encouraged to develop bands, orchestras, etc. And they had citywide orchestras, and the music service covered from, if you like, traditional Irish music right through to symphony orchestras, brass bands, a balalaika group, as well as two major choirs, Manchester Girls' Choir and Manchester Boys' Choir. Now, when one looks at what has happened since then, we still have, if you like, the outdoor education. Unfortunately, the music service has been decimated, and that was thanks very much to Tony Blair. Blair had his attitude towards education, and he summed it up in my book when he talked about bog standard secondary schools, or comprehensive schools. He had an utter contempt. He had a contempt for counsellors, and he had a contempt for, if you like, services that councils provided. To him, the average councillor in England was in Doncaster, where the councillor would be on the racecourse committee, because Doncaster has a municipal racecourse, and it has one of the classics, the St. Ledger, and it was all councillors fiddling expenses. That was his attitude, instead of councillors being, if you like, representatives of the people, providing a service for the people. And I think what got me, reading a report back in the 80s, there was a report on music services in England and Wales. And there were two councils that were next together on this report. One was Kingston upon Thames, and the other one was Kingston upon Hull. Kingston upon Thames had zero input from the local authority into their music service. Kingston upon Hull put in £120,000, and that just about summed it up. The music service in Manchester covered everything from tiny tots, I think they call them the polka dots, young children in a choir, through to a real adult and teenage choir, and that they were really good. Now, what happened was that the government took over the funding of music services away from the councils. But what happened then was a real death blow to the music service, which was a lifelong learning thing, that it only provided funding for schools and basically blocked councils providing money for music services for people not in schools. And that meant a death to the orchestras kept on, the brass bands kept on, but totally denuded of funding from the city council. The other thing I'd just like to touch on was nurseries. In the 1980s, when the left took over in Manchester, we went down to London to see what their local services were and to see what the nursery provision was. And we came away. We thought we'd be going to London to see how brilliant places like Newham and Hackney and where was Red Ken, places like that were doing. We came back saying, well, it was a wasted journey because we were light years in advance of these so-called progressive London authorities. And the last thing I'd like to touch on, because Manchester had a programme to have a nursery in every primary school. A lot of primary schools already had nurseries, but that was a programme. The last thing I'd like to touch on is academisation. At the moment, I have some friends who are in Catholic schools, and the Catholic Diocese of Salford is going for a massive programme of academisation. Now, that programme has already robbed schools, and I use the word rob quite deliberately, of £14 million. They've denuded school budgets for the benefit of the centre. And all I've heard about academies is bad news for working class kids. It's bad news for everybody, except academy boards, who are all on fat salaries and all doing very nicely, thank you. I'm sorry, I mean, I'm now 85 and I'm a bit out of things, but I would like to know if there is any national body that is fighting academisation, because I feel I would like to, get involved or contribute to that, because it really angers me the way that, particularly in Manchester, in the Salford Diocese, they are literally the academy has already taken £14 million out of Catholic school budgets and is in the process of going through 9 industrial tribunals because they've sacked 9 head teachers who are claiming what they call it constructive dismissal. And it just angers me that schools that had a reputation of being happy, play-based, really doing a good job with the kids, and now, just, well, we're going back to the dark ages. I'll leave it at that, comrades.
Thank you, John. There's very valuable information there illustrating the damage that can be done in the education system by taking out such things as the enjoyment in music and education and the enjoyment in outdoor pursuits for kids. Anything that diminishes the enjoyment of kids in school diminishes their future in terms of their social involvement and activities. So thank you for these illustrations. Matthew was the next person indicated he wanted to speak.
Yeah, just going on from the last
Roger. Yeah.
I think
after Matthew, then Roger.
Sorry. Yeah, that's right. I mean, the problem is that, of course, what we face is a position in virtually all countries of the world that education is actually under attack. I mean, certainly in all the imperialist countries, it's bad. Starting with the US, obviously, the massive stripping of education budgets, etc., people being sacked, all over the place. Every time you read anything about schools in the US, it's about people being removed from the service and so on, services being cut. At a time, obviously, when the US is actually spending, I think, something about the same as the annual budget of my city, Glasgow, on destroying Iran every day. So the priority is not education. The priority, obviously, is war. And we can see this all over in all countries, and worst of all, of course, in the global south. And absolutely the lowest, of course, is the genocide in Gaza, which has been committed. It's not an Israeli thing. It's actually committed by the entirety of imperialism. And the central part of the genocide was scholasticide. They've made every effort to destroy the education system of Gaza, including, because obviously Gaza, they made enormous effort to educate the population. They had huge numbers of schools. They had at least 10 or 11 universities in a tiny little place, which is essentially a prison camp. And that education system has been systematically flattened. There's been hundreds of academics have been killed, thousands of teachers, tens of thousands of students at all levels, 63 universities.
I'm sorry, Matt, somebody needs to mute. There's interference conversation coming across. So I don't know who it is, but go ahead, Matthew.
Yeah, 63 university buildings have been blown up. I mean, they actually showed this. I mean, the IDF being not particularly bright, they illustrate their own war crimes on social media. You can watch them do it. So they've systematically taken that entire system apart. Virtually every school in Gaza has been damaged, and many of them have been destroyed. So, I mean, in those terms, and that's not something that's been done in one place. That is now the standard. I mean, it's now happening in Lebanon and I suspect Iran. Certainly in Lebanon, the methods of attacking medical staff are being used there by the Israelis, which they've deliberately targeted medical facilities and paramedics in particular. I would suspect they'll be targeting schools as well. So this is the point of what the methods of imperialism, actually, of barbarism, we're attacking education all over the place. And the question is, how can we actually organise to respond to that and both defend the system we've got and produce something that's better than what we've got? And really, it's that sort of contrast. Thanks.
Thank you, Matthew. Roger.
Okay, thanks, comrades. A number of kind of random and sort of scattered ideas that I like to raise. I thought Carel gave a very, very good, comprehensive opening to the discussion. I think we have to start by saying, under capitalism, of course, education has a very strictly limited purpose. It's to educate workers at different levels up to the standard that is needed by society, and absolutely no more than that. And in other words, to actually stifle education beyond the needs of capitalist society. And I'd like to explain, kind of give some examples of what I mean. But to say that having made that general point, there have been periods, limited periods, in limited places where education has been allowed to develop beyond the needs of capitalist society, and really you could say the kind of during from the 60s and the 70s, perhaps in Britain, you had the comprehensive movement, which Finn described, which did open up opportunities for education and for the developing talents, even beyond what capitalist society necessarily always wanted. But now that has been crushed again. When we have this process, Carel talked about the academization program. Academization is actually, it's not only a question of the privatization, because in practice, it means the education, the privatization of the education system, because there's not one element in capitalist society which is allowed to function now without being driven into privatization and taken out of the public realm and public accountability. But it's worse than that, because the curriculum under the academization program and all the laws that went with it has been to completely stifle and crush anything which smacked of any kind of inspiration or imagination or anything beyond the grad grind needs, if you like, of the education system. I'd like to make a few points in relation to that. For instance, Carel talked about the university, the repayment of university student loans for university students. Now, I mean, it is ridiculous. It's actually kind of almost Alice in Wonderland logic, because the justification which the government apologists have given for this is that, well, if you have a degree, then you can get a better job. But if you have a better job, you'll get more income, and therefore, why shouldn't you repay the loan that was given to you in order to get the qualification in the first place? Well, the point is, first of all, if society needs doctors and engineers and accountants and architects, etc., then society should pay for them too. It's a question of investment in the talent that society actually needs. It's not a question of privileges for the people who actually fulfil that position. And secondly, if it's true, as they always argue as in defence of, well, you see, if you become a doctor, your income will be higher, so you can afford to pay back the cost of your training. Well, if your income is higher, then your tax will be higher too. So that's a complete nonsensical. It just doesn't make sense. It's a complete sleight of hand justification for actually making the students pay for the investment that society ought to be making on its own account. I'd like to say another couple of things. Finn mentions the absolutely barbaric punitive system that used to exist, which was actually physical torture. And they've replaced that, thank God for that. Instead of that, though, but we now have instead systematic mental torture instead. The so-called inclusion system, which is actually a system of sensory deprivation, where kids are taken out of the classroom if they're alleged to be disruptive and so on, and put in a special room. And I've been in many schools, and I've for part of my working life, I've been a teacher, been in many schools, and I've seen these inclusion rooms, and they're actually designed with screens so that the kids are put into kind of cubicles, and they're supervised, and they're not allowed to talk, they're not allowed to look at their phones. All they can see is maybe a computer screen in front of them, and they've got some homework they've got to complete in that time. Now, that you might say, well, if it's for half a day or for a couple of lessons, well, it won't do them any harm. But I know that there are places, there are schools where kids are sent there day after day after day for the full day, and that is systematic sensory deprivation. It's like solitary confinement, and it has mental, debilitating mental effects. I know. I mean, I was once I was put in charge of such a room just for one lesson, and the kids at lunchtime, when it's their lunchtime, they are not allowed out at the same time as the other kids. So they're not allowed even to see their friends in the break time. They're just told after the proper lunch break, they can go out for 5 minutes and buy a sandwich and bring it back. And because I let the kid look at his phone while he was eating his sandwich, I was fired because that was not allowed. It's systematic mental torture instead of physical torture, in effect, which was the punitive system of the past. Now, I also want to say that the now that we did have a system, and still in some schools for some subjects, you had a system of where there was no streaming or setting, where it was mixed ability, so-called mixed ability teaching, and I very much enjoyed doing that, and I found, particularly teaching English, that many kids who would be considered even illiterate sometimes, but they would have amazing skills in interpretation of Shakespeare plays or something. So it was completely wrong to kind of sort people out according to some artificial codification into different categories of ability and so on. And I'd like to just finish on that. The what is actually happening now is that systematically they're forcing through the stratification of kids into different sets or different so-called streams, which means that they're systematically prevented from reaching beyond a preordained limit on their abilities, so-called. And again, it's completely wrong. It's a complete misunderstanding, and it's an abuse of the potential and the talents of kids. I'd like to say just one last thing. In the school where I taught for about 10 years, I was an English teacher, and I pushed beyond the limit. I developed a magazine where I insisted that kids could submit anything they want, provided there was absolutely no schoolwork or homework allowed, but only things that they wrote because they actually decided they wanted to. And I got the most amazing. I mean, I'm sorry, might sound gushing or sentimental, but some amazingly sort of talents discovered. People like, in the same way as Benjamin Zephaniah, for instance, who was a criminal, and he was a prisoner, and he taught himself to write, and he became an absolutely outstanding and very popular um, poet. And in the same way, I found people who were equally talented, equally good. Black kids who are, there's one poem which I wish I could show the comrades, but it was a kid who from a black family who had police harassment. I know that he ended up with long jail sentences because of the life he got into and so on. But he wrote the most amazing poem, full of incredibly effective metaphors, describing the horrors of the life he lived in a kind of ghetto in the poor part of London. But one last thing I did was I organised meetings, and I was kind of they turned a blind eye to it, and I was allowed to organise. When Muslim Beg was released from Guantanamo after 3 years solitary confinement and torture in Guantanamo camp, when I heard that he'd been released and came back to Britain, I invited him to come to the school and speak to a meeting. And we had 200 kids, mostly black kids, black and Asian kids. And he addressed them. It was a bit funny because he said before he came, he said, I was a bit nervous about speaking. And I thought, look, this guy's undergone torture by the Americans in a concentration camp. Why are you afraid to come and speak to a bunch of kids? But he came. He was absolutely superb. But what was important is this, and this is the last point I want to make, that these kids who you can't get to keep quiet sometimes for 5 minutes or 1 minute, with the kind of curriculum which is rammed down their throats in the lessons. But they came there, 200 kids turned up, mostly, kids without any very high academic record or standard or anything else. They came in, and you couldn't hear a chair squeak. There was not one word spoken. Nobody was playing with their phones. They were in completely and utterly rapt attention from beginning to end at a meeting which lasted an hour and a half to 2 hours. And they were absolutely enthralled. And therefore, this idea is, oh, kids, you see this all the time. Oh, kids nowadays don't have an attention span of more than 2 minutes. So what can you do? You give them something worth listening to, and you find you've got no complaints about their attention span. And that was exactly the point that I had. And I did a number of meetings like this. I had meetings of, there was a black American who was on death row, unjustly. He was innocent, but he'd been 10 years on death row. And his sister and nephew came on a world tour campaigning for support. So I invited them to come and speak at the meeting. And again, it was a black woman and a black kid of about 15. And they were just talking about, to release my uncle and my brother from the horrors of a condemned cell. And again, about 200 kids came. There's complete, absolute. Not the prisoner actually wrote an article for the magazine from his prison cell, from his condemned cell, thanking us for organising the meeting. And unfortunately, soon after that, he was executed. And you can imagine the effect that had on the kids that had attended that meeting and so on. So there's lots you can do, but you've got to get round the system, because the system is there to crush initiative and imagination. And the kids, in my experience, and I'm sure it's true of anybody who's ever worked with kids in any school or in any context whatsoever, they've got absolutely everything it takes to build a new society, and it's the schools that are failing them if they don't if they don't succeed in educating them the way that they want to. So I'll finish on that.
Thank you, Roger. Very good illustrations there about the attempts to suppress the independent thinking and independent analysis that kids innately possess, but nothing will break the spirit of people, as you've explained. So very, very valuable. We're going to win this one in terms of independent thought, insofar as we can. Now, who next wants to speak? I don't see any indications, but
Finn, shall I pick up a couple of points?
yeah, by all means, Carel. By all means, yeah.
Okay, well, thanks everyone who's made a contribution. I'll just pick up a couple of points. First of all, Norma's point that about education and being an individual right and being more than that. And you said that in some regions of the world, it should be posed as a human right, not just education, but health, etc., should be posed as a human right. Absolutely, it should be posed as a human right, particularly in areas where girls are forbidden to go to school, where there's no proper health service for girls and women. And you mentioned about education has declined or is declining, and that it pushes parents who can afford it to move their kids into private schools, and that's a trend. That has been a trend in the UK as well. Another trend, which this is such a big subject, I couldn't go into all of it, but there is another trend, and that is homeschooling, because parents feel very strongly that their children are not getting the education that they want for them, and they may not be able to afford a private school. I mean, a good private school fees are in the thousands of pounds each term, and not many people can afford that. So homeschooling has always been a small homeschooling movement, but it's grown hugely over the past decade. And well, basically, homeschoolers are linking up, sorting out their own sort of organisation where a teacher can teach one subject. They're teaching, or parents have got a specialism in a subject or got a qualification in a subject. They're teaching groups of children. And I know many parents that are using homeschooling methods now, and I don't blame them for that. As a head teacher, I wasn't very happy about homeschooling. And then the government under David Cameron brought in a system where you can have part homeschooling. So a child could be in school for part of a week and be homeschooled for, say, 2 days or 3 days a week. And actually, when parents came to me and they wanted that because they wanted to have a lot of music, or they had a child who had a particular talent in sport and they wanted them to have tuition in that during the day, it actually worked brilliantly well. And I changed my mind about it. Is the current system punitive? Oh, it is punitive. It isn't just chaotic, it is punitive. And I think Roger's illustrated that. The kids that are out of school, excluded, suspended, expelled, or those that are punished in the exclusion rooms, many of them are black kids, many of them have English as an additional language, many of them are kids from immigrant backgrounds, or they have learning difficulties, special educational needs. These are vulnerable children that are made more vulnerable by a system. So, yeah, we don't beat them with a cane anymore. We could do that, I think, up until 1979, because I remember when I qualified in 1978, I was teaching 6-year-olds, and the head teacher called me into her office and she showed me a ruler, and she said, if they're naughty, you can smack them with the ruler. I was absolutely aghast at that. She said, yeah, but I want you, if you do decide to do that, I want you to do it with a senior member of staff present, and you smack them on the hands or the back of the leg. Suffice to say, I've never done that. I never would do it. But the thought of a kid in a booth for days on end, not being able to talk to anybody, maybe that is worse. I think you could argue that it is mental torture over a long period of time. So the system is punitive in this country, and it is chaotic. John, thank you. That was very interesting what you said about municipal socialism in Manchester, the adult education system, and the wonderful outdoor education centre at Lake Windermere. What a lovely thing. I'm sorry about the music service, but while it lasted, it sounds absolutely phenomenal. I tried very hard as a head teacher to make sure that we had lots of music. And just a little brief story which might make you smile. Every child in my school, at great expense in the school budget, mind, learned to play an instrument from year 3 onwards. And the younger children, just as you had the polka dots, we had children in choirs and playing recorders in year 2. And we had a couple of orchestras as well. We had to decide as a school that we were going to do that. When we had Ofsted, we did quite well, and the leader of the education committee at the time was a Conservative. He came round the school, he looked around and he was glowing, happy, how wonderful it was that the school was doing so well. And then he started to hear the instruments being played. And he said, "Oh, it's so wonderful." This was as he was leaving, and I'm standing at the school door with him, and he said, "Oh, it's so wonderful to hear all this music, so wonderful." And he said, where's this inspiration you have, Mrs. Buxton? Where does it come from?" And I looked at him and I thought, I don't give a monkey's, I'm going to say it. I said, "Oh, have you heard about the Bolivarian Youth Orchestra in Venezuela? Well, I take my cue from Hugo Chavez, who said that children need to have a rounded curriculum." And at that point, the blood drained from his face because he realised he was dealing with a socialist and he was a rampant Tory. So, yeah, fantastic stories. And if you want to know about how you can fight back against academies, I think there's two things I would say to your friends who are in the Catholic schools. I know that it's not just in Manchester area, but it's also Liverpool and in Essex. The Catholic diocese are doing the same thing. The Anti-Academy Alliance will be helpful. You can Google them. The best way forward is for school parents, committees to start setting up committees with the head teachers and the staff of the school to think about how they can force those schools to rethink that policy and force the diocese to rethink that policy. And that needs to spill over into the Catholic churches where so many of those parents go on a Sunday morning, so that the priest and the bishop understand that there's massive opposition to that. It has to be built. And that's the way where we had successfully opposed academy. That was the way we did it in the East End of London. In terms of Matthew, I take on board your point about, the priority for the system is war, genocide. How many children have been murdered in Gaza, being murdered in Lebanon? We're told that little girls don't go to school in Iran. And yet 160 plus of them were murdered and killed by a bomb that even I think the Americans have now said was from them. It's a mistake, but it was from them. All those little people have died. And so children don't go to school, but then they drop bombs on them and they do go to school. So, and finally, Roger, thank you for that. I have a little bit of knowledge of your Carbolic magazine because I've still got copies that you've given me, and it is inspirational. And you're right, that education has been allowed in periods to develop beyond the needs of capitalism, which is why somebody like me, born 12 years after the end of World War II, actually that door opened and I was pushed through it. I must say, kicking and screaming by my parents, but I was pushed through it and I became a teacher. And there certainly now is a grad grind curriculum, which wasn't the curriculum that I had, or I'm sure that you had. Degrees aren't privileges. Of course they're not. But those young people now who are paying back huge amounts of money, if you're wealthy, your parents can pay the £11,000 a year fees for university, but they also can buy you a flat to live in a place like Manchester, or pay the rent on a flat. But ordinary working class kids have to top up their grant with a maintenance element. So they have to pay for their own housing, food, subsistence, and they have to pay that back. So they may not be paying back £11,000 a year. They might be paying £20,000 plus a year. I totally agree with you, Roger, about mixed ability classes. The system is there to crush kids now, and it's there to crush the staff too, to stifle any creativity, any individuality, any happiness. And even with little children, they don't play enough. They sit at a desk too often, too much. And I have every confidence in my class and in young people to be able to say what they want, articulate what they want and what they need, and how, and they can sensibly and intelligently work with sympathetic adults to create better schools. Much harder now than it was 10 years ago. And it was much better in the 60s and 70s when we were allowed to be creative, develop individualist approaches, and develop lifelong learning. Now we're in a very, very different position with, as Matthew indicated, the barbarism of the system moving towards war, but we still have to fight it. And there are schools that are still doing that and still, leading the good fight.
Thank you, Carol. Very valuable directions on how to struggle against the oppressive system that kids are living through. Now, we'll be approaching the end of the meeting, so if there are comrades who want to make additional points, they can come in. There was a very good summary, anyway, Carol, you've just given of the issues that have been raised, but if comrades want to raise other points, they're welcome to do so. Otherwise, we'll ask Carol if she wants to make some final comments to. So, Carol, did you want to make some additional remarks? I mean, you gave a very good sum. Oh, hold on, there's a hand up here. Who is it? Person called Workers International Network. Is that Dave? Is it? No, it's Matthew.
Yeah. Hi. Sorry, guys. I think it's also. I think there's also. I think there's a method, isn't there, in all this sort of stuff. I mean, there was a means, that's been run by all of these, various extremely right-wing think tanks in order to crush down, and destroy all forms of creativity in the education system. I mean, you can note the methods of Gove as an education secretary, in which he tried to eliminate, most forms of art and music, etc., as things that he didn't want kids to go anywhere near, and then therefore that the whole thing should be on the basis of these super oppressive methods. I mean, in this country, obviously, you've got. I mean, Ofgem should be, the regulator that's used by the government for all this stuff should be looked at as a means of oppressing teachers, actually. I mean, there should be a demand for the thing to be abolished, because that's what it does. That's what it's there to do, is as much as anything else, is to oppress any form of creativity, and particularly among teachers. And therefore, we should be calling for it to be removed, and for something different. But the thing is, as I say, that there is, these really quite sinister efforts by various operations. I mean, we can know also in the States, in which the Trump administration is trying to destroy the Department of Education, wants to close it down, essentially as a means of removing money from schools. But under conditions, and again, in which they want to prescribe a very, very limited curriculum. And I think the other thing, of course, was the effort of Thatcher, and everybody who's come after Thatcher. I mean, Thatcher effectively changed all the thinking, and Keith Joseph and these monstrous people changed the whole thinking on education. But the whole thing in higher education, of course, was to remove the left and to say, well, universities people shouldn't be allowed to discuss any form of left-wing things. And in many ways, that's been quite successful, actually, is to remove the left and remove thinking on the left in higher education, because obviously the ruling class doesn't want people to be questioning the system. It merely wants them to serve it, and so we get this whole notion that education should purely be linked to the needs of capital or the state or whatever else, shouldn't be linked to any form of creativity or people thinking about the world, and that schools and universities should purely serve the needs of business or the state. as is happening. I mean, you can see it now. I mean, universities. I mean, basically the government directs them to form partnerships, as it were, in which the capitalists dictate what is researched and the rest of it. Mostly, either making profits or killing people, which are the two things they're interested in. But we should, we have to be, say, in terms of fighting that whole sort of method, which is being applied in quite systematically.
Thanks, Mitchell. So, Carel, do you want to make closing points?
Thank you. I'll just say a couple of things. I think you're quite right, Matthew. It's like, the monsters have taken over, haven't they? But not entirely. Only to a point. In terms of, I avoided Mrs. Thatcher's name. I think I mentioned Mr. Gove. So I'm going to say something about him. He was very, very keen on reformed as he called it, reformed the history curriculum. History was my subject at college, and can you imagine? Everything has to be taught in chronological order in history. I mean, an understanding of chronology in history is vitally important to an understanding of the subject. However, can you imagine how difficult it is to teach the Stone Age to children of 7 and 8 years old? Because that's what teachers in the national curriculum in Britain have to do. It is it's not an interesting area of history particularly. It is very, very obscure and extraordinarily difficult for a child of 6 or 7 to understand. And I believe that this is about killing a fantastic subject for children. It's about killing it. How you make that accessible, your brain really goes into overdrive. We tried. You can only have a partial success with it. What I would say is that we have to fight where we stand. The world is ablaze, and education is one of the victims, and we have to fight only where we stand. So where there are smaller struggles going on in your locality, you get involved with them. If there's teachers on the picket line outside a school fighting academisation, on strike for better conditions, better wages, etc., or they're fighting actually for lower class sizes, for a better education for children, then you go and join them where you can. We can't influence and stop Donald Trump and the American military bombing Lebanon or Iran. What we can do is talk to people in our community about those issues and get involved in local struggles where they're happening. I think, that's what I would say. And if any of you don't know about Fred Hampton, please Google him, because he's written some fantastic things about education in America and the liberation, the mental, freeing people from the mental slavery that has existed through capitalist education. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Carel. I'm sure all the comrades will agree. It's been a very, very valuable discussion, not only in the points that have been raised and the very extensive range of activities that have been covered, but also things that will cause us all to go away and think a bit more deeply about the questions, and we'll all be wiser as a consequence. So I want to thank Carel again for a very, very good opening contribution. The comrades who contributed made very significant contributions to the debate, and I want to thank all the comrades who spoke. And Carel was a very, very good summing up of the discussion. and point us to the ideas that we have to consider further and to implement, and not to get swept away with issues that we can't affect, but to look at areas where we can have some influence and to become active, even if it just means walking up to a picket line or attending a parents' meeting. So thank you again, Carel, for a very significant contribution to the meeting, and thanks again to the comrades. So now we'll have a few words about next week's meeting, if Roger wants to say something on it.
Well, maybe Matthew would like to speak, because the subject next week is what we're all absolutely concerned about day and night at the moment. Probably the most dangerous situation that any of us have ever seen in our lifetime, and that's the war with Iran. So Matthew is going to speak about that. So we're also going to have Comrade Aman, our Iranian comrade, also contributing to that discussion. But Matthew, would you like to say more about that?
Well, obviously things are going to change in the next week as well, but it is a variety of madness. I mean, obviously we've got basically the entire Middle East being blown up one way or another, and so I mean, people are being dragged into this. I mean, not only Iran is being systematically flattened, as is Lebanon. You've got in excess of 3 million refugees in Iran, something approaching 1 million in Lebanon already. So yeah, it's extremely crazy, and there appears to be no way out at this point, because obviously the Trump administration doesn't want to stop. So yeah, as I say, I think it will be a useful discussion, but as I say, the situation will have changed in 7 days. So thanks.
Thank you, Matthew. So all the comrades are invited, of course, to attend this discussion at the same time next Sunday. So with that, thank you all again for your attendance and for your contribution. So we'll close the meeting. So as I say, Slán a good luck to you all.